Welcome to Level Up Houdini. You being here means that you decided learning Houdini and truly understanding it from the ground up is something that is important to you. Whether you're brand new to 3D, an experienced 3D artist, new to Houdini, or have been using Houdini already, you're in the right place. Within these videos, files, lessons, and challenges, I will provide you with the structured approach and guide you along the path I wish I had when I started my Houdini journey. I was once where you are now, and I can tell you with certainty that if you put the work in, ask questions when you're challenged, and sincerely try your best, you will be surprised with what you're able to accomplish. I will guide you every step of the way, and I know you will be able to do this, but it will be up to you to decide if that is true for yourself. This course was designed very intentionally. I've put a lot of time and effort into organizing and separating each level, section, and lesson in the order they are introduced in. If you truly would like to get the most out of the course, I'd recommend going through in the order the lessons are organized. This course will also evolve, grow, and have new sections and new levels added based on how you, the students, ask questions and give feedback. If a section could benefit from more lessons, then those might be added later, and new boss battles will continue to be added to help showcase new workflows and new challenges. So please do ask questions. If something doesn't make sense, let me know, and I'll either help you understand it or work to change the lesson so that it does make sense. A few tips to get the most out of this course would be the following. Set aside some time just for this course, whether that's 30 minutes a day, or even just 1 hour a week. Focus on making a commitment and sticking to it. Lesson videos might need to be watched multiple times through. That's okay. Don't get discouraged if it takes 2 or 3 attempts to understand something. Keep notes. When you're watching a video or working through a lesson, write down things that stick out or write down questions that you have. Looking back at these later will help you feel progress as you slowly are adding to your understanding as you go. Try to rephrase the lessons in your own words. Once you learn a concept or a new node, think about how you would explain that new knowledge to a friend. If you can explain something simply, then that likely means you understand it well. And watch every lesson. Each lesson might seem simple, but that's because Houdini is simple once you're able to understand it. To get to the end goal of using Houdini, you'll need to understand every topic introduced and also be able to apply these topics and these ideas to your own projects. So I'll be here to guide you through that. And most importantly, stay excited and stay curious. You're watching this now because you want to learn Houdini. Remember that. It should be fun, enjoyable, and always remember that this is something that you are able to accomplish. And I'll be here to make sure of that. Everything in the world of 3D breaks down to a few fundamental pieces, but in order to best learn how these all work and fit together, we're going to start at the most basic of these pieces and work our way up. We'll start with a point. This point is just that, a single dot we can think of as being infinitely small. In 3D, the only information we would need to create this point would be its location. So since this point is at the center of our screen, let's say it has a location of 0, 0, 0. These location values, or coordinates as we call them, define the position of the point in 3D space, and the numbers themselves represent the distance of the point from another location. Typically, this other location is the world origin, and all the distances are measured from that location. So this value of 0, 0, 0 in this case means the distance on the x-axis from the points to this world origin is 0. The same for the y-axis and the same for the z-axis. When we define a point's position relative to the world origin or the world's coordinate system, we call this world space. Now this point isn't that exciting, so let's add another point 1 unit away. this point will have another location of its own based on its distance from the world origin, 1, 0, 0. Between these 2 points, we can add a line to connect them. Now, since the only information stored here are the 2 locations of the points and the line itself, this line technically has no thickness, meaning that we actually wouldn't be able to see it. We also wouldn't be able to see these points either unless we copied or instanced something onto the points, or if we told our computer to render these points or render the line with a certain thickness or scale. If we add another point at location 1, 0, 1 and another at 0, 0, 1 and connect these other points with more of these lines, we'll have a full square. Now this square is just the edges of the shape itself and only makes up the perimeter of the square with nothing filling the shape inside. Sometimes in 3D and Houdini, we'd refer to these connections as edges or curves, where they just represent the connections between the points, but don't actually have any flat areas themselves. We'll need to add a shape or a plane connecting all these points, and this shape here is our first polygon. If we repeat this process with more points, edges, and polygons for all 6 sides, we can create the shape of our cube, which we will call a mesh. Now, when polygons have 4 sides like these ones here, we call them quads. When they have 3 sides, we call them tris or triangles, and when they have more than 4 sides, we call them n-gons. Now, every program has slightly different names for each part of the mesh or each part of the model, so depending on your background in other software, there might be different names you've heard before, so do keep that in mind, but fundamentally, this all remains the same. Now, let's recap the lesson here. First, this might be a lot of information for now, so don't be discouraged. This will all make sense, and once we continue learning, you'll gain a more complete understanding of these all. With these lesson recaps we'll sometimes have, I'll share and re-emphasize the important parts to understand, and then in the outline below this video, I'll also recap some more important notes so you can use those to refresh later. For this lesson, the important concepts are that points represent locations in 3D space, edges or curves represent connections between points, and polygons represent the connections between edges to form the larger area. We'll extend on these ideas once we start using Houdini. If this lesson made sense, feel free to mark it as completed by clicking the button above the video, as that will help you keep track of your progress in the course. And again, if you have questions, please ask, and don't get discouraged as you work through this course. You might have to watch a few of these videos again, and that's okay. You've got this. In the last lesson, we covered that our cube is made of points, edges, and polygons. These parts are usually collectively referred to as a mesh, and we also learned that the location of points are defined in terms of their distance from a specific location, typically the world origin. So the point with location 1, 2, 3 would mean that on the x-axis, it's 1 unit away from the origin. The y-axis, it's 2 units away from the origin. And on the z-axis, it's 3 units away. These positions can also be negative as well. And as we move the cube around in 3D space, all we're doing is offsetting each point's location by a certain amount. These points, edges, and polygons can all be arranged in any order, and we can have any number of them in a single mesh. When we arrange them in the shape of a cube, we get the shape of a cube. But by arranging them in different ways, we can also get different shapes. If we arrange them in the shape of a sphere, you guessed it, we'd get a sphere. These two meshes are built out of the same foundational pieces, but they look different based on their structure. Similar to how you can use Legos to build just about anything, you can use these points, edges, and polygons to build anything you can think of. Another important thing is the reason we organize them in meshes. When we look at points of a mesh, we typically say each point belongs to a mesh or is part of a mesh. This is so we can do a few things, but mostly so we can organize, save, and adjust each mesh accordingly and individually. If we wanted to color the cube red and the sphere blue, since they are different meshes, this is an easy thing to do. And as we get bigger scenes and more complex models, we can choose to organize our meshes in any way we see fit. Points and polygons also don't have to be connected to be part of the same mesh. They can be disconnected and still be considered part of the same mesh. There also are some times where we don't even think about grouping these points or polygons into meshes at all, so we typically only do that when it's helpful. As we continue to explore how we can arrange polygons, we'll see that we can arrange them in any possible way we could imagine. In fact, if we wanted to make a dinosaur, all we need to do is arrange these points, edges, and polygons in the shape of a dinosaur. We can also increase the resolution or the number of polygons we use to get more detail in our mesh. As a mesh continues to have more polygons, we typically say it is higher resolution, and when a mesh has fewer polygons or low polygon count, we might say it has less resolution or even is low poly. This art style of low poly is something you might have heard of and just means that the meshes are designed with fewer polygons. Now, let's recap the lesson here and we'll review the key parts. Polygons, points, and edges can all be arranged into different shapes to make different objects or meshes. Cubes, spheres, and dinosaurs are all fundamentally made up of the same parts, just at different placements. And when referring to one object, like the cube or the dinosaur, we typically refer to it as a mesh. And when talking about the points or parts of a mesh, we use the terminology of ownership to say a point might belong to the mesh. We'll continue to explore these later and even see some cases where the idea of belonging doesn't really make sense. But it is important to know that the way we choose to organize these points, edges, and meshes all helps us work with more complex scenes. So far, we've learned that polygons are built up of points and edges arranged in different locations. And the way we organize these and place these polygons can help us create any shape we can think of, from a cube to a dinosaur. We've also learned that we typically organize these polygons and group them into meshes to help with organization and to make our lives easier. We also learned that this isn't always done, and in fact, in some cases and in some arguments, it isn't technically required, but it does make it possible to build more complex scenes and build up an understanding of how entire worlds can be put together and organized, one piece at a time. And to start looking at how these bigger worlds are put together, we'll break down the foundational concepts of what makes up these more complex worlds in 3D that we call scenes. To start, let's imagine our cube we learned about in the last few lessons is something that is so magical and so noteworthy that it needs to be put on display in a museum. Our goal now is to make this happen. So if we want to build a world around our cube, or a scene, we might call it, and eventually put together a full museum, we can start back at our basics and think of how we would approach this. Right now, all we have is a cube made up of points, edges, and polygons. We've learned in the past that these polygons can be arranged in any shape to make anything we can think of. So let's start to think. First, we'll make a podium. We'll arrange some new polygons to make a cylinder-like podium and put it underneath our cube. Then we'll make a floor. To do this, we'll make a really big square with some more points, edges, and polygons, and then put that mesh underneath our podium. We can continue to make some walls behind our cube by connecting some rectangle-shaped boxes, and then eventually surround our cube with enough walls to make a full room. We'll add a ceiling by using another box, and we could choose to continue this scene if we wanted by adding more boxes for walls, for floors, and adding extra rooms, or even making another podium to show off our dinosaur from the last lesson. But we'll stop for now. Although this is a simple example, hopefully you can start to see the idea that by adding and arranging these polygons into different meshes and different shapes, we can start to build up our basic museum. these parts of the scene that are built and made up of different points and polygons, we refer to as geometry. Now, in addition to geometry, there's two more basic parts we might need in order to actually save an image of this beautiful museum we've designed for our cube. If we were now to tell the computer to take a photo of this scene, there's one important thing it would need to ask in order to do that, and that would be from where. Similar to how if you were walking and taking a photo in real life, you would have to be standing somewhere in this museum. So we need to tell the computer where to be standing and where to look to take this photo. And that is done by adding a camera to our scene. With this camera, we can set up a lot of things, but most importantly, we use it to tell the computer where to take the photo from and where to be looking in our museum. Now, if we took this photo with our newly added camera, we would see that it's pitch black. Because similar to the real world, we also need to have lights in our scene for the camera to be able to see our beautiful cube. So if we added a few lights and placed them around our museum, we could look back and admire the work we've accomplished. All these parts put together, the polygons and meshes for the floor, the cameras and the lights, we would collectively refer to as our scene. We can extend this scene if we wanted to add another podium for the dinosaur, or even make a brand new scene for that if we wanted to. We could add more rooms, multiple floors, or even shelves to the walls. But the key part to understand here is that in 3D, we have the flexibility to choose how to arrange these components of meshes, cameras, and lights, all to create whatever worlds we want. And we have the flexibility to make these worlds as detailed or as complex as we want. That's entirely up to us. So far, we've built up our first world or scene, starting with simple points, edges, and polygons. We arranged these into the full scene by adding meshes to represent our museum, and some lights and even a camera. But now, everything in the scene would still look plain and boring if we decided to render it. Our cube, the podium, our floor, and the walls are all still uncolored. They exist in our scene and could cast shadows and interact with the light, but visually they aren't very interesting. If we were to render the scene now, they would be gray, flat polygons and uncolored lights. So to make our world come alive, we'll need to add something that can help us choose how each object should look. And in 3D, this is done with a material. Materials define the look of our objects and surfaces, and specifically, they tell the computer when light hits this object, here's what it should look like. Different materials can make the same mesh look vastly different. For example, if we gave our cube a metal material, it would reflect light sharply, creating a shiny mirror-like appearance. A glass material would allow the light to bounce through it to create refractions and transparency. And a rough plastic material would scatter light softly and create a matte look. In 3D, we're able to use these different materials to turn simple points and polygons or geometry into more interesting things to look at. These materials control the color, reflectivity, roughness, and many other characteristics of our objects. If we imagined our museum scene again and we wanted it to look a bit more interesting, we could add a gold metallic material to the cube. For our podium, we could add a polished marble material, and the floor, we could make a nice polished wood material. None of these materials change the actual geometry or the individual polygons of our mesh and models, but they allow us to control the appearance of these meshes with full control. Materials can be as simple or as complex as we want. We can use colors, constant values, and even images in our materials to choose how they look. These images, or textures we call them, however, do need a bit more information to map onto our polygons. So this is where UVs come into play. UVs, or UV coordinates, are a way to map a 2D image onto a 3D object. The letters themselves, U and V, represent the horizontal and vertical axes we use to map the width of an image and the height of an image to the model itself. These coordinates can be thought of in a similar way to wrapping paper on a gift. If we fold and wrap this paper around a box, for example, we can see the wrapping paper pattern aligned to the shape of the box. These coordinates let us control how the image maps to the object and stops the image from stretching, twisting, or repeating in unpredictable ways. Now, to recap the lesson, we've learned that materials are a property we can assign to our meshes or our geometry to control how they look and how the light interacts with these surfaces. These materials define the color, reflectivity, roughness, and other visual aspects of how the object itself looks. And in addition to using constant values such as red or green, we can also use images or textures in materials on our objects. And these textures are mapped to the object using a coordinate system we call UV coordinates. In the past few lessons, we've covered the key parts of what make up a scene, from meshes made of polygons, points, and edges, to lights, materials, and cameras. We've learned that these are all important for creating a scene in 3D and determining how it looks. But up until now, we've been thinking of the scene in 3 dimensions, where we have an X, Y, and Z axis. And within this scene, we can position our camera anywhere in the scene to determine what the computer is looking at. But there's one more key part of the camera that is critical for us to understand, and that is how the 3D scene is translated into the 2D pixels of a render through a process called rendering. Rendering is a process of how the computer takes the 3D scene and creates the 2D image that you can see and share. Just like in the real world, how we can take a camera, choose where to stand and what to photograph, our computer can do a similar process with our 3D scene. In 3D, the camera decides where we're standing, what part of the scene we're looking at, and how zoomed in we are. During rendering, we can also decide the resolution of our image, or in other words, how many pixels it will contain. When the computer renders our scene, it takes the position of the camera, and from that position, it shoots out a bunch of invisible rays for each pixel in the image. These rays bounce throughout the scene, interact with our objects, the materials, and the lights, and then report back to the computer to tell the renderer what color the pixel should be. The more rays we let the computer send out, or the more times we allow the rays to bounce, the longer this render might take, but the more accurate we can get this render to be. Now this process itself gets really complicated really quickly, so this is a very simplified explanation, and I do encourage you to look more into it if you're interested. But this is all we'll need to know for now, and this gives you a big picture understanding of how your 3D scene becomes a final 2D image. Once we start to set up our own scenes in Houdini, we'll see more of this and more of the details in practice. Now that we've learned of the general components and parts that build up what we call a scene, we're going to need to explore a key concept, and for the purpose of this course, I'll define that concept as tiers of information. And to illustrate this idea, let's think of an example. Our example will be a 2D image. If we think about this 2D image as a collection of information or data, we can break it down into lots of different parts of information. Almost endless things actually, that all might be relevant to the image file itself. To start, let's list all the relevant pieces of information that might exist. First, we'll take our image and imagine a friend just emailed it to us. We downloaded it to our computer and saved it to our desktop. If we start to think about the information we've dealt with so far, already we have the file name, maybe my first image, the file type, maybe it's a PNG, the file location on disk we saved it to, and then we have the image file itself, which might be 1024 pixels by 2048 pixels. And once we open up the file, we'll see that each of the pixels 2,097,152 to be exact, all have a different color. And since it's a PNG, some of the pixels are even transparent. So for each of the 2,097,152 pixels, they all have a red, green, blue, and alpha value that represent their color. So now we have an additional 8,377,608 pieces of information that we can list out. Now, even from such a simple example as a single PNG image, we can quickly see how much information or data needs to be stored and organized just for our computer to even download this file and display it correctly. Now let's extend this idea a bit further, and we'll start to think about all this data and how it's organized and displayed for us in a way that lets us actually make use of the data and even modify it. To do this, we'll think of some of the examples of how we'll modify this data, and then how we're able to interact with or edit certain parts of this data without having to think about other parts of the data. It will make sense, I promise. In this image, the file name, the location of our hard drive, and the pixel values are all important. But if we had to think about all that information all at the same time, it would make working with the data pretty cumbersome. Ideally, we should be able to focus just on what we need. For example, if we want to crop the photo, we really shouldn't need to care about its file name. If we want to color correct the photo, we shouldn't need to care about whether we saved it to downloads or desktop. And if we wanted to change the name of the file, we shouldn't need to care about whether the image is 1024 pixels wide or 2048 pixels wide. Each piece of information is relevant in different use cases, or in other words, relevant based on what we want to do with that information. In some sense, we could say that each piece of information really only matters to us when we're working on parts of the information that are in the same tier, in the same hierarchy level, or even in the same context. And these computer programs we're using, such as email, Photoshop, or Google Drive, are smart enough to help limit our access to this data based on how we're using it. They are also smart enough to restrict our ability to modify this data if it doesn't make sense in the context we're working. For example, when we are renaming a file on our desktop, we can't access the individual pixel values. Although our computer has access to the pixel data, it has no relevance for the task we're trying to complete. Now, to recap this lesson, we've learned that an image can be thought of as a collection of information or a collection of data. From where you saved it on your computer to the number of pixels in the image, all of this information is important. When we work with this information, our computers and we as humans think of this information in different tiers, and we're able to modify information within these tiers without affecting the other information. We can crop our photos without changing where they're saved. We can rename photos without changing how many pixels that photo has. And as we do these tasks and continue working with the data to email, share, edit, and view these images, our computer helps organize the information and only lets us modify and see the information that's important for what we're doing at that time. In the last lesson, we covered that even something as simple as a PNG image can be thought of as a collection of information. We learned that we and our computers are able to organize this data into different tiers of information, where we're able to modify different pieces of data without affecting other pieces. We could rename a file without changing its color, or we could move the file from our downloads folder to our desktop folder without having to worry about how many pixels the image had. All of these pieces of information are important to represent our image, but thinking of all the information all at once would be overwhelming. This is the same in 3D. Our scenes and everything that we can make can be thought of as data. And if we take a simple example and start listing out all the information, we can begin to see how much data there is. In this example scene, we have a few shapes, some lights, a floor, and a back wall. Each of these objects, or meshes, we've learned in past lessons is made up of polygons. And each of these polygons is made up of edges and points, all arranged in different locations. The lights all have different locations. They have colors, intensities, sizes, and even sometimes directions that they are pointing. Each object in the scene might have materials, and each material would have values for the color of the object, how reflective it is, and dozens of other properties. To render this image, we've also learned that there's a camera, which is placed at a location in our 3D scene. This camera would have data such as the direction it's facing, its focal length or field of view, and there would even be information and data to represent how many pixels our final image and render should be. Now, in the same way we had an information overload when thinking of all the information included in our PNG image, this happens pretty easily with 3D scenes. And in the same way as our 2D image, where we needed to edit and make changes to some parts of the data without affecting others, this is something that is equally important in 3D. For example, when working with this 3D scene, we should be able to move the camera without caring if the cube was green or if it was blue. We should be able to make the sphere bigger without caring if our floor was metal or if it was wood. And in the same way our image was broken down into multiple tiers of information, our 3D scene should be thought of as well in a similar way, where we can modify and interact with this data without having to care about all the parts of it at once. Now, to recap this lesson, we've learned a few key things. We've learned that our scenes can be thought of as information. Our shapes and meshes are made up of hundreds or millions of points and polygons. Our lights and cameras all have locations in the 3D scene, and our materials might have all different colors and properties. And when working in 3D, we've learned that it would be important to be able to organize this information in a way that makes working with it and modifying it easy and enjoyable. Don't worry about the specifics of how we do that yet. Those lessons will come later. But for now, just continue to understand the concepts and theory that we're talking about. In the last lesson, we covered that every part of our 3D scene, from the polygons to the lights to the camera and materials, can all be thought of as data. Now, this was a relatively simple scene we looked at with just a few shapes, with some lights and basic materials. But as scenes get more complex, we can start to see how this data will increase in complexity as well. Now let's start to think of a new scene, and this time we'll continue to expand it. If instead of a small studio setup with some shapes, we wanted a whole neighborhood, we could begin by organizing some polygons into the shape of a house. We'll maybe have a few houses, and then make some trees with a few more polygons, and a fence or two to go around the houses. With each new object we add, the house, the trees, and the fences, the amount of data in our scene increases. Each mesh has more polygons, and each polygon has more points. If we added lamp posts, those would have more polygons as well, and even lights for the light bulbs. Each lamp post light might have a location, a size, a color, and an intensity. Great, this neighborhood is looking pretty good. But let's pause and look at our scene again. As we look at it more, we can start to notice that some of this data, or some of this information, is very similar. For example, these lamp posts all look the same and all have the same shape, but the only difference is their location. The fences all look similar, but again, the only difference is their location, and this time, their rotation. This is a common situation in 3D, where data is so similar it is almost identical. In fact, some parts of the data are so similar that it would be beneficial and just easier for us to be able to copy and reuse this same data again at multiple places in our scene. And when we have access to this data through software such as Houdini, we, the artists, have full control over exactly how we want to organize it and reuse it. In fact, so much control that there are actually multiple ways to do this type of copying data in Houdini, and we'll learn about a lot of those later. If we needed to add a forest or bushes to this neighborhood, we could either create hundreds of individual trees, all with their own individual polygons, or we could make one tree and copy it hundreds of times, just changing its location and size. This becomes a key part of 3D, and especially a key part of using Houdini, the concept of reusing data. Understanding this concept and learning how to apply it will be almost a superpower when you continue to use Houdini. It saves the computer and us humans memory, time, and effort. So as our scene grows in size and in complexity, we don't necessarily have more types of data. These objects all fundamentally are still points and polygons, but we do have more of it. More points, more materials, more lights, and more things to organize. Now, to recap the lesson, all scenes from basic cubes and shapes to full neighborhoods and cities are all made up of data. As these scenes grow in size and complexity, there's more data to keep track of. And as we do this, we can copy it, move it, and even use the exact same data in multiple places. So by reusing this data, or even just parts of this data, this becomes a key skill to learn how to do, and is something we'll start to do a lot of later in the course. In the last few lessons, we've covered that our scenes all break down into data, from the polygons to the materials, to the lights we scatter throughout the scene, and the meshes themselves. These can be all thought of as information. We also saw that as a scene grows in complexity from a simple sphere to a full neighborhood, these types of data we have remain similar, but we just have more of it. More meshes, more houses, more polygons, and more things to organize. Now let's think back to our 2D image example. Remember the PNG image we thought about when we learned about information in tiers? And remember how we were able to modify parts of this image's data independently. We could rename the file without changing its size, or we could move the file from downloads to desktop without caring about the color of the image. Each change we made on the image was changing information within a different tier or part of the image file. The same principle applies in 3D. We can think about our scene as different kinds of data, where we have geometry, which are the polygons, points, edges, and curves. We have materials, which define the properties of how our geometry look and react to light. And we have lights, which illuminate and brighten our scene. We also have cameras, which let us control where we are viewing our scene from. But each of these types of data should be able to be modified independently without affecting the others. We can change the material of an object without affecting its geometry. We can adjust the lights in the scene without having to worry about the camera. And remember how we learned that data could also be reused in our scenes? This is true, in fact, for all types of data. We can reuse materials, we can reuse lights, we can reuse cameras, and as we use Houdini, we'll be seeing this in practice in lots of places. Houdini is a software that is perfectly designed to let us access and reuse this data, but with great power comes great responsibility. Although we have access to this data, this also means that we have the responsibility to organize and keep the data nice and clean for us to work with. It's just as easy to get the data all jumbled up and messy as it is to keep it organized. So we'll start next to think about how we can approach this organization. In the last lesson, we recapped that all the data in our scene can be thought of as belonging to separate tiers, meaning individual tiers, like materials, could be modified without having to worry about the data in different tiers, such as the camera. Let's continue that and explore more of the types of categories we have. Let's take a simple scene of this little house. We have the house, some trees, the fence, and this time we'll have some clouds. We'll start with the house and look at the type of data it has. The house has its own geometry, where the geometry and polygons define the overall shape. The walls, the roof, the windows, and the doors, these are all made up of points, edges, and polygons, just like every geometry we've learned about so far. The house also has materials, where these might be red brick for the walls, clear glass for the windows, and a wood material for the front door. Each of these materials would have data about its color, roughness, and maybe a few texture maps. In this scene, we also might have lighting data, so we could have a light for the sun, maybe a few lights around the house to brighten things up, and then a lamp post or two might be in front of the house as well. And each of these lights have their own data of color, location, intensity, and similar values. To render the scene, we'd also have to create a camera, which is what we use to tell the computer where to be looking from and where to be looking at. In this example, we also have a new type of data here we haven't seen yet, and that's for the clouds. These clouds would be volumes, and are the same type of data we'd use when rendering smoke or fire. We'll get more into these later, but for now, just know they are another way we can represent a type of information. If we continue this process for each of our objects, for the fences and for the trees, we can see all the types of data we now have in this scene, and how each object has its own information. In the next lesson, we'll continue this and start organizing this data into broader categories. In the last lesson, we broke down the data we have in this scene here and looked at the information the objects had. Now, we're going to take that data and think about how it could be organized into the broader categories we've learned about so far. We can list out the categories and start grouping the data. 1. Geometry. In this category, we'd have everything that is made of polygons. The house walls, the tree trunks, the fence boards, all of these are geometry, and they are all defining the shape of our objects and scene. 2. Volumes. This was a new category that we just introduced, but these volumes are typically used to store information for things like smoke, fog, and fire. Anything that would be a soft mass and not necessarily a solid object. In our case here, we have the clouds, and these would be volumes, but we also might have some atmospheric haze that is a volume as well. 3. Materials. This category was the information that controlled how the light interacted with our objects, and thereby the overall look of our objects. These would be used to define materials such as brick, wood, metal, and even the color of the clouds. 4. Lights. Lights in our scene, just like in the real world, are what brighten it up and make everything visible. They can cast shadows, be visible in reflections, and illuminate parts of the scene that we want to be brighter. 5. Cameras. Finally, the camera is what we use to define the viewpoint of how our computer sees the scene. It tells the computer where to look from and what to look at. And it can also be handy for setting up other settings for our render. Each of these general categories serves a purpose towards making our scenes look great. And by understanding what parts of our scene fits into what categories, we can begin to plan how we organize the scenes and work to create our final result. As we explored in the last lesson, we saw that all the different types of data in the scene fall within a few major categories in 3D. In this lesson, we'll explore a few examples of how we could modify this data and expect it to be independent. In the same way we can make changes to parts of our 2D PNG image a few lessons back, we we should be able to modify parts of this data without having to worry about other parts of the data that might be affected. This separation lets us organize our work and even lets us split the work between artists if we want them to help with different parts of our scene. We'll recap quickly the 5 categories we've covered and then explore these examples of making changes. 1. Geometry. These are the polygons in our scene, defining the shape and form of our meshes and models. 2. Volumes. These are the objects in the scene that aren't solid. Commonly, they might be clouds, fire, smoke, or mist, and we'll explore these later in more technical detail. 3. Materials. These are the properties of how objects look. Materials can be assigned to geometry as well as volumes. 4. Lights. Lights illuminate the scene just like in the real world. And 5. Cameras. These are how we control what parts of the scene we are rendering and looking at. Within these 5 categories, we're able to group just about every part of the scene that we can see. And as we can work on these individual tiers or categories independently. For example, in a scene with our house and neighborhood, moving the camera shouldn't change the color of the house. We should be able to make the house taller as well without having to worry about the fence changing shape. We should be able to adjust the lighting of our scene to make it nighttime without the trees being rotated. The way our data is separated, and in fact the way that Houdini works, all let us make these changes without needing to affect the other areas. But doing this effectively does rely on us to actually organize the scene in a smart way, and we'll be taking a look at that later. Now that we've broken down the parts and data of our scene into these 5 general categories, I wanted to give a quick disclaimer about some of the categories we've mentioned. Although these categories are helpful when organizing and planning a scene, there are a few overlaps and blurry lines that we should mention. These will all make more sense once we start applying projects in our boss battles section, but for now, just try to remember 2 key ideas. 1. For geometry and volumes, data here can sometimes be interchanged back and forth. A common thing we do in Houdini is convert geometry into volumes and convert volumes back into geometry. For example, we might make a polygon sphere that is in the shape of a cloud and then convert it to a volume to render it as a puffy cloud. This process is also very common when creating effects and simulations. Oftentimes, we will create information or data on geometry and points, and then convert that data into a volume through a process called rasterization. This is because Houdini has some simulations and some simulation solvers that work on volumes and some that work on geometry. Don't worry about fully understanding this yet, but just know that there are a few use cases where we can do things with volumes that we can't do with geometry, and there might be a few cases where we can do things with geometry that we can't do with volumes. And 2, the other thing to know is that for lights, we mentioned that they are what contribute light to a scene, but in fact, some types of materials can also contribute light to a scene as well. Materials can be assigned to both geometry and volumes, and they have a property called emission or the emissive channel, where we can set them to contribute light to the scene. This might be used on geometry, for example, to create sparks that brighten a scene, or might be used on volumes to create a fire that flickers and brightens the scene as well. For now, just understand that there are a few ways for materials to control the emission of light, and that both geometry and volumes can have the ability to emit light if we want them to. There are a few other data overlaps, but we won't get into those yet, and we might get into them as we start using Houdini in later levels, but for now, we're making great progress, so keep it up. Now that we've introduced all our key data types that build our scenes, let's expand on the key idea that everything we see in 3D is ultimately built of the same building blocks. In this lesson, we'll take a look at geometry and volumes and see how these two building blocks can create just about everything that Houdini is known for. Because when you look at all the things Houdini is known for, sparks, explosions, water splashes, smoke, and destruction, even lightning effects, they are all made up of the same few building blocks. And these building blocks are geometry and volumes. Everything you've ever seen simulated inside Houdini, whether it's a spark shower, a collapsing building, a swirling cloud, or even a planet-sized explosion, they are all made up of these two types of data working together. By understanding this, we can start to see how these fundamental building blocks can be combined and used to create these cool effects we can see. And eventually, we can learn how we might build these own effects ourselves. Let's take a look at a few examples more in depth. Sparks. When we see sparks shoot across a scene, what's actually happening is just hundreds, thousands, or even millions of points moving through space. Each point might represent a single glowing point, a small tube with tiny thickness, or a tiny polygon mesh that looks like a spark or ember shape. These tiny meshes would have positions in space, velocities for our render engine to calculate motion blur, and then a color for the emission of the light that they emit. That's it. When we render it, these are so small and they're moving so quickly that together they look like a burst of light and energy. Lightning. Now if we took a similar setup as sparks and connect a few neighboring points with edges and polygons, we can build the jagged path of a lightning strike. These lightning strikes are just fast moving, small jagged pieces of a mesh that glow. And when they're animated, flicker, and flash around our scene, they give the appearance of a lightning strike. When rendered, we can give them thickness, additional randomization with the use of noises, and glows. And then suddenly they feel electric. Splashes and water. Water works a bit differently. At first, it's simulated as points, each one representing a small droplet or tiny piece of fluid. But then when we want to render it, these points are converted first into a volume, which is a continuous surface that gives us the smooth, flowing look of the water. In Houdini, this process is often done using a VDB. The process of using a VDB, converting from the points to the mesh, is a process called meshing, and it's a very common thing we do with water. When the water is rendered, we render it as a mesh, but we can also render additional splashes, water foam, or water droplets as mist, which might be a volume. And the combination of these layers are what creates a full, believable liquid simulation. This same process is in fact how we create all types of liquids and fluids, so lava or honey would also be created in a similar way. Smoke and fire. Both smoke and fire work in a similar way to each other. They are volumes, which means instead of meshes made up of points and polygons, there are 3D grid that have values stored at each location in the grid. These locations we call voxels, and we can think of as 3-dimensional pixels. A smoke simulation might store a single float value for density and then a vector value for velocity. This single float would be a decimal point number indicating how dense or thick the smoke is at that location in the grid, or that particular voxel. And then the velocity value would be stored as a 3-dimensional vector, which would be which direction that voxel's smoke is moving. This velocity arrangement of voxels we can then use in our render engine to blur the fast-moving smoke and fire. We also commonly call an arrangement of voxels or a 3D grid of voxels a field, because the values stored inside the voxels create a value field, meaning any location in this 3D space has a value we can compute. We can also interpolate between voxels, so we could calculate the average of two neighboring voxels. One important thing to note is that volumes in voxels can also be two-dimensional. A common use of two-dimensional volumes or a two-dimensional grid of voxels in Houdini is a height field, where every voxel in this field has a float value for its height. Fire also has a temperature value field that we use for emission, so when we render it in Houdini, we can know which parts of the flame should be brighter than others. This is a similar workflow as when we create magic effects as well. So all the information of flame explosions, dust hits, and smoke is just data stored inside a 3D grid. Every puff of smoke and every flicker of flame is coming from those volume values changing over time. Destruction. Destruction is a bit of an interesting case, but the general idea is that the geometry, like this cube here, is fractured into smaller chunks of geometry. And then for each of the fractured chunks or pieces, we create lines between neighboring chunks to connect them. These lines, pictured here as orange lines, are what we call constraints, because in the simulations, they're able to constrain the pieces together. These constraints can be rigid, flexible, or even break and form during the simulation. And controlling how these constraints behave is a huge part of how destruction is created and art directed. We then tell Houdini to think of each fractured piece of geometry as a single point through a process called packing the geometry. And then on this packed geometry, we then simulate. Having each fractured piece be stored and represented as a single point through the process of packing is much more efficient for Houdini and for our computer. So we can have much larger and more complex scenes and effects. So whether we're working with points flying through the air or volumes swirling through space, all of these complex effects we see in Houdini come down to these two core building blocks of geometry and volumes. And the way they work together, the way they move, and the way we render them gives us the flexibility to create any effect we can think of. Don't worry about the specifics of how these all work just yet. The key idea here is to know that these fundamental building blocks are what can be layered up to create the big, exciting effects that we see. So understanding the foundation of these pieces becomes important. Next up, we're going to learn about a few approaches to organizing our data. These approaches will be important to see because once we start implementing this in Houdini, we'll see lots of similarities and begin to understand how our data is moving. And if we can keep our data organized, that will help us greatly as we start to make bigger scenes and even projects with multiple scenes. One important thing to note as well is that Houdini by default does some organization for us, but it is our responsibility to understand how this data is being organized and how to extend this organization for what we need. I'll share two general approaches we might use when assembling and organizing a scene, and then we'll explore reasons why we might choose either one. The two general approaches we'll discuss, we'll call organizing by category and organizing by object. And the first of these two is organizing by category. Is about as simple as it seems. Let's imagine a folder for our data. This folder we'll name /scene name, very exciting, I know, and inside this folder we'll create a subfolder for each of the general categories we've learned about so far. So inside scene name, we'd have a subfolder for geometry, one for materials, one for lights, and one for cameras. And then inside each of these folders, we'd organize our data there. So inside the scene geometry folder, we'd put every object that was geometry. So thinking back to our last example, we might here have a house, our trees, and our fence meshes. Inside the scene materials folder, we'd put all the different materials for our house, for our fence, and for our trees. The same idea goes for the scene name lights folder. where we'd put our lights, and the scene name cameras folder, where we'd put our cameras. This approach works great for simple scenes and sometimes even larger scenes if you can manage to keep it well organized. But the other approach we'll discuss might be better for some of those bigger scenes. That next approach we'll call organizing by object. So instead of the individual folders for each type of data, we'd create a folder for each of the objects in the scene. If we started with the same scene name folder, that might end up looking like this for our sample scene. Inside of scene name, we'd have a subfolder for house, a subfolder for trees, one for fences, another one for lampposts, one for cameras, and one as well for lights. This approach would then have us store all the models and materials for the house in the scene name house folder, and then the same for the trees and the fences. We can even extend this idea further if we wanted to add and have more subfolders for the different types of objects in our scene. So that might look something like this. Inside of scene names, we'd have a subfolder buildings, and inside of that, we'd have a subfolder for houses and a subfolder for apartments. Inside of scene name plants, we'd have a subfolder for trees and one as well for grass, and then inside a props subfolder, we would also have another subfolder for fences and one for lampposts. Now you can start to see that in a similar way to how we organize files on our desktop, we also have that ability to organize and keep track of our 3D data that would exist in our scenes. And you probably can remember a time where you misplaced a file on your computer or named it incorrectly, and after you spent lots of time looking for that file, now you might be aware of how important proper organization can be. This type of organization that we've covered in this lesson is actually very similar to how we will work in the stage context of Houdini, which is where we'll actually be assembling our scenes. So lots of the ideas we've mentioned here in our breakdown and organization will become a key part to how we plan our scenes. In the last video, we discussed two general approaches to organizing our data. We mentioned the idea of organizing by category, where we split objects into organization-like folders based on their type, and we also mentioned organizing by object, where we grouped the data by the object it belongs to. So the geometry and materials for the house might be under the house subfolder. This organization we also mentioned is very similar to how we're able to organize in the stage context of Houdini. Don't worry about that yet. We'll explore contexts and all that later. All you need to know now is that these ideas will directly relate to how we implement our scenes in Houdini. In fact, remember how we mentioned we can reuse data in Houdini? This organization is one of those ways we can reuse certain types of data. To explore that, let's start simple. Imagine we have a small neighborhood scene, a few houses lined up on a street. Each house has geometry for its roof, walls, and windows, and they have materials to control their color and look. Maybe there's a brick material and a wood material, and then maybe a few lights as well on the front porch. Now, let's imagine a situation where we want to change the color of the houses. Maybe instead of red brick, we want them to be blue houses instead. If we had our materials organized by category, this would be a quick change. We'd find the scene name materials subfolder, grab the brick material, and then change its color. And every house that was using or referencing that brick material would then have its color updated. Done. But if we had organized our data by object, that would be a different story. If each house had its own folder, house 1, house 2, house 3, where each house had its own material inside that folder, then to change the color on all the houses, we'd have to go individually, one by one, to change them all manually. In this situation, we can see the benefit of organizing this data by category. Now, let's think of another situation. say we want to take one of the houses and make it extra tall. Maybe this house is renovating and adding a few extra floors on top, but we only want to change a single house. In this case, organizing by object would help us. If we had organized by object, we could go to where we stored the geometry for that individual house and then switch just that house. So whether we want to make changes to just one part of the scene individually, such as one house, or multiple parts at the same time, such as changing the color of all the houses, the way we've organized our data can help determine how easy that process is. And as scenes get bigger, this process of organizing becomes even more important. Imagine an entire city where dozens of buildings all share and reference the same brick material. We could adjust that material in one spot and have it propagate across our entire city. But if we didn't stay organized and had dozens of brick materials, then changing all of them would be a long and tedious process. We can now see that organization is not only helpful for cleanliness, but it's also about control. By knowing exactly where your data is stored and how it connects to the rest of the scene, you can have confidence when making changes and always know what you're affecting and what you're not affecting. Now, to recap the lesson, we've learned that organizing by category and organizing by object can each have their own advantages. Organizing by object might help us make changes to one building without affecting the others, and organizing by category might let us have changes to one material or one part of the scene and have it propagate across every building or every part of the scene. But the important part here remains that in order to do this effectively, we have to know where our data is, and we have to know how it's organized throughout our scene. This helps us stay in control at all times. In the last lesson, we learned how different organization methods affect the way we can work with and make changes to our scene. We saw that organizing by category can help make global changes quick and easy, and that organizing by object can help us keep fine-tuned control over individual buildings and props. But since this is Houdini, we can have the best of both worlds. Now let's take a look at what happens when we combine both. Most experienced artists, whether they know it or not, are making use of a mix of both methods. And most 3D software lets you do this sometimes without having to think about it. But to have full control in Houdini, we'll want to learn about these strategies first before we start to implement them. To do this, let's go back to our city example. We have here a small neighborhood with some trees, fences, houses, and lampposts. If we wanted all the houses to share the same brick material, we could store this material somewhere like scene name, materials, our brick material. And if we wanted each house to be able to have separate geometry, to maybe be changed later, we could store these in their own locations like scene name houses, house 1, and scene name houses, house 2, in a similar way for house 3. That way, if we want to change the brick material across all houses, that's a quick thing to do. And if we want to change the shape of each house individually, we can easily do that as well. This kind of organization gives us the best of both worlds. We can even do this with lights, cameras, and other parts of the scene. By understanding how this works, we can create one main scene and then have multiple lighting setups shared between other scenes. We could have one building and then split that scene into two different sub-scenes, where one is day and one is night. And as our projects begin to grow in complexity, this approach becomes even more valuable. Houdini is a software that lets us take full advantage of this, but only if we plan ahead and know what we're trying to accomplish. Now, I want to mention one more thing, a quick disclaimer. In Houdini, there is no technically correct way to organize a scene. The approaches I'm sharing with you have been proven to work for me across multiple projects in multiple years. And bigger studios and individual artists may have their own preferred ways of working. I encourage you to find a structure that works for you and, equally as important, works for future you. So when you come back to projects months or even years later, you can jump right back in and continue working. There's also ways to use Houdini without thinking ahead about this kind of organization and about the things we've discussed so far. In fact, many courses don't teach you this, and you're left to learn it out either on your own or from previous 3D experience. But I'm here not only to help you use Houdini, but to help you understand it and get the most out of it. So if this is all new to you, then keep working and stay encouraged. These concepts will make applying Houdini much more enjoyable and much more powerful. Now, to recap the lesson. Most artists, myself included, use a mix of both the organization by category and the organization by object. They decide what data they want shared and what data they want separate. Learning how to decide on an approach will not only help you stay organized, but will help you make changes in the future quick and painless. This is especially important if you want to use Houdini for freelancing, client work. Having your own project organized in the right way can literally save you days of work, and by that, it can save you lots and lots of money as well. In the last few lessons, we've been learning about data and the types of data we can use to create our scenes. But in this video, we'll take a break and quickly introduce something a bit more practical: the types of file formats you might encounter when working with Houdini. I'll also introduce a few common things you might encounter with each file type and where they might be used. Just like a Word document stores text and an image stores pixels, each file format Houdini uses is designed to store a specific type of information. Understanding what formats these are and when to use them will help you manage your projects and exchange data efficiently and effectively. We'll start with native Houdini file formats. The .hip or HIP file is the most common one. This is a Houdini project file. It saves your nodes, your networks, and the work you've done. HIP-NC is the non-commercial version of the Houdini file, and it's what Houdini saves when you're working with the free apprentice version. HIP-LC is the limited commercial version of Houdini file. It's what you're saved when you're working with Houdini Indie, which is what I'll be using. These three file types all represent your Houdini project, which is the actual working file that stores your nodes, your networks, and their connections. Next up, we have geometry and scene data formats. These file types are used for saving geometry, objects, and sometimes even full scenes. BGEO.SC. This is Houdini's native cache file format, and it stores just about all the file types you need to cache, and it does so very efficiently. .abc is an alembic file, and this is common for going back and forth between 3D software. I personally used alembic files a bunch when I would go back and forth from Houdini to Cinema 4D, but it's a widely used file type and can store lots of information. FBX, this is another widely used file format that stores geometry and animation, and it's most commonly used for meshes, characters, or character rigs. USD, this is a USD file or a universal scene description file, and it can pretty much store anything, but it is natively used in Houdini's Stage or Solaris context, and the important thing to know here is that USD is not just a file type, but it's also a whole way of organizing and storing 3D scenes. This is something we'll introduce in later lessons. Next up, we have volume files, and this is a .vdb. This is an open VDB file and is used to store volumetric data. This would be used for clouds, smoke, explosions, fire, or other similar effects. You can also store VDBs or volumes in bgeo.sc files, which is something we'll get to once we start using them. Next up, we have the texture or image formats. EXR, this is probably the most helpful image format we'll be using. It's optimized for storing high dynamic range images and renders, and can even have multiple layers that makes it extremely useful for compositing. PNG. This is a standard 2D image format most commonly used for textures, and it's helpful since it's an easy image format to work with and can store transparency data as well. JPEG. This is as well a standard 2D image format, and in general, you wouldn't need to use this much. Sometimes textures are in the JPEG format, but this file type often compresses data a lot. It can reduce the quality of our renders if we choose to use it for rendering. .rat. This is a Houdini file type and its native texture type. Commonly, it's generated by Houdini automatically and is more efficient to use and store. If you see this, then don't worry about it. Most likely Houdini has generated it for you. Next up, we have some more of the less common but still helpful file formats. OBJ is a geometry format that is widespread and supported in most software. I personally do not use it much, but sometimes when you buy 3D models, you'll download a .obj file. STL. This is a 3D file format that is common in 3D printing and engineering 3D software, such as CAD. It's typically messy to work with and only stores the geometry of the object itself. And that covers most of the file types you'll see and use. Each type has its own specific role, and when you go back and forth between different software, you might be using more and more of these. But in general, when working with Houdini, I would recommend the following. When saving geometry caches or simulations, use bgeo.sc. When exporting to another 3D software, use FBX or USD. If you're rendering, always use EXR. And if you're exporting image or textures, again, always use EXR. If I'm exporting a file to email to myself or just a quick work in progress screenshot for fun, I might use PNG or JPEG, but that's usually the only case where I do. These 4 file types of bgeo.sc, FBX, USD, and EXR cover about 99% of my work in Houdini, 3D, and 3D freelancing in general, and are the only main file types that we'll be using for this program. In the last lesson, we covered the common file types you'd use when working with Houdini. But if you've used Houdini before, you might be aware that Houdini doesn't really have the same way of working with these file types as other programs do. In Houdini, instead of doing a file save as to export a model, we have to do it manually and tell Houdini what to save, what file type to use, and where to save it. This is the same for loading files. We typically wouldn't do file import model as we might do in other programs. In Houdini, we have to tell it specifically what file to load and from where. These ideas of saving and loading files are often referred to as writing and reading files. When we save information to a file, we say we are writing to that file. And when we load information from a file, we say we are reading that file. You'll see this lots of places in Houdini. We might say a file node is writing a cache, or the node is reading the data back in. Caching is also a term you'll hear and use a lot, and we'll actually cover that in some later lessons. But caching typically is the term for a specific type of writing. Caching is usually used when talking about writing or saving simulations. One quick note, Houdini also considers writing, saving, caching, and rendering all very similar processes, which means that sometimes these terms are used interchangeably or in places you might not expect. For example, sometimes when working with Houdini and saving geometry, we call it rendering the geometry, and to actually save the file, we'd click a button on the node that is named render. It's a different type of rendering than what a render engine does, but just think of it now as a type of writing information. We'll see these all later and how they all fit together. It will take a while as well to get used to this, but once you do learn this language, it does make it easier to work with Houdini. Remember, in Houdini, we're dealing with data, so we are constantly writing and reading this data back and forth between our hard drive. So don't get discouraged either if it doesn't make sense now. The key idea to learn from this lesson is that writing is saving a file to disk and reading is loading a file from disk. Since we're on the topic of files, I wanted to give a quick bonus introduction to a common workflow you might encounter. Don't worry about the specifics, but I'll just recap a common thing I used to do when working with other software. Say you wanted to go from Blender or Cinema 4D to Houdini and then back. A workflow for that might look like the following. 1. Starting in Blender or Cinema 4D. Let's imagine we've created a model in Cinema 4D or Blender, maybe a simple product, like a watch or a shoe. We want to take that model into Houdini to add effects or procedural details, and then bring it back to Cinema 4D or Blender for lighting and final rendering. To do that, we'll first need to export the geometry in a file format Houdini understands, and one of the most common file formats for this is FBX. FBX files store geometry and animation data, which makes them perfect for transferring models between our different programs. So the first step is to export our model from Cinema 4D as an FBX file. Step 2, import into Houdini. Next up, we need to read that data into Houdini, and to do that, we would use a file node. This lets us read the .fbx and bring in the points, geometry, and polygons. From there, we could do what we'd like in Houdini, maybe add some extra details to the model, or use it in a simulation. Whatever we did here, while we're working inside Houdini, we'd save the information in a bgeo.sc file, which is Houdini's native cache format. Step 3. From there, if we wanted to render in Houdini, we could keep it as the bgeo.sc file, but if we wanted to export it back to Cinema 4D or Blender, we would then write or save it back out to an FBX, ABC, or USD file. If we did a simulation with volumes such as smoke, we'd use a VDB file for that part of the data. Step 4 would be then we'd import the FBX, ABC, or VDB files back into Cinema 4D or Blender to light and render. This workflow is a common one artists might use when coming from a background in Cinema 4D or Blender to start slowly getting used to Houdini. However, I choose to do, and you will also be learning how to do 100% of this in Houdini, because that's why you're here after all. The funny thing though is, once you learn how to do it in Houdini, it's actually a lot simpler than this workflow I just described. And the benefit of doing it all in Houdini is that you never have to leave the software. So, to recap the lesson, knowing these file types might also help you go back and forth between different 3D programs. However, doing everything is possible in Houdini, and is actually my preferred way of working. But as you level up your skills with Houdini, there may be situations where clients or teammates are sending you FBX files or other file types for you to start with. So knowing how these work and how to work with these becomes important. In later boss battles, we'll see some situations of importing and managing file types, so definitely get excited for those. In the last few lessons, we've explored how Houdini stores data in different file types and different categories of data, like lights, materials, and geometry. But now we'll zoom in closer and look at how Houdini and actually computers store that data internally. When Houdini and computers are storing information, they need to know what kind of information is being stored. A number with just whole numbers isn't the same as a number with decimal places. A word isn't the same as a color. And a list of numbers or an array isn't the same as a single number. Houdini and computers store this information in a few different data types. And the most common ones you'll see when working with Houdini are the following. A float, or a single floating point number, is a number with a decimal place like 1.234 or 1.1. These can be negative as well. An int or an integer is a number with no decimal places, or a whole number, like 1, 55, or even 69. These can be negative as well. A vector, and most commonly a 3D vector, is a group or an array of 3 numbers. These are usually used to store positions, directions, or even colors. A string is a text-based value like my name or superhero or even brick. These data types are the most common ones we'll use in Houdini, and we'll continue to explore them in later levels. The other thing to know of is attributes. Houdini can store these data types on the actual geometry itself. So, if you remember how we learned about points having a location, Houdini actually uses a vector attribute to store that point's location. And for an object having a color, Houdini might use a vector attribute as well to store that color's red, green, and blue channels. When data is being stored on geometry or on something, we would call it an attribute. Viewing these attributes is basically the most detailed and granular way we can view our data in Houdini. And we'll do this all with a very big spreadsheet called the geometry spreadsheet. So if you had a dinosaur mesh in Houdini, you could see every single point and the vector storing every single point's location inside this giant spreadsheet. Houdini also lets us work with data without having to save it to anything. When we work with the data types floats, integers, strings, and other similar types, and aren't saving them to anything, we call these variables. So we might use variables in some code to set up the logic that if a point is more than 5 units away from the world origin, it should be colored blue. And then we could write the color blue, a vector attributes with 0, 0, 1, meaning 0 for red, 0 for green, and 1 for the blue channel, to this point, and then only when we save it to the points itself, we would call that an attribute. This will make more sense later, and it is a slight distinction between the two. Oftentimes, we'll use variables that are saved to attributes and also read attributes and use them in different variables. So, to recap this lesson, we've covered that computers and Houdini store information as specific data types, like floats, integers, vectors, and strings. Variables are temporary values we use for calculations, while attributes are stored permanently on the geometry. We'll get more practice with these later, and it will click once we start applying them all in Houdini. In the last lesson, we covered that computers and Houdini all store different data types of floats, vectors, and strings. Now we'll look bigger picture and see how some of these data types can be used in different situations. The great thing about Houdini is that since we have access to this granular data, we can choose how we use it. And we can even reuse the exact same data in different areas. Let's look at an example, and we'll see how this same data has different uses based on how we choose to use it. Let's imagine we take a grid of polygons and paint a color across that grid. We can think of this grid as a piece of terrain, and maybe this color we paint, we want to represent a path along the middle of that terrain. This color data, which we can store as a vector attribute on the points themselves, can be used in a few different ways. Firstly, we could take this color data, and when we're applying our materials, we could say that we want the parts of the grid with green colors to be a grass material, and the parts or the polygons of the grid that have blue colors to be a dirt material. In this same exact setup, we could also tell Houdini to scatter rocks on the grid, but only scatter rocks on the parts of the grid that are blue. So we can create a few rocks that are on our little pathway. We could even extend this and tell Houdini to scatter trees, but only on the parts of the grid that are green. In reality, we can extend this to whatever we'd like, which is one of the most powerful things about having access to this data. To recap this lesson, we've learned that the data we have in our scene and the attributes we have throughout Houdini can have many uses. We can choose to interpret this data in any way we see fit. And we can even do multiple things with the same data. Now, this is just a simple example, but understanding this data lets you begin to use it creatively across every single part of your scene and project. So far, we've learned that meshes are built up of points, edges, and polygons arranged in different locations. But there's one additional part of meshes we haven't yet mentioned, and something that will be important as we start to use Houdini. This one is a bit of a unique case to Houdini, as some 3D programs don't make the unique distinction between these parts of the mesh, or even let you access and use them. This additional layer of a mesh we'll learn about in this lesson are vertices, or a single vertex. To see what these are, let's look closer at a polygon. When we look at a mesh in Houdini, we can see it's made up of points and edges, but in fact, Houdini allows us to access these polygons' vertices. In this diagram here, the polygon is the purple area, the points are blue, the edges are green, and the vertices are the orange connections, shown here as the connections between the polygon itself and the points. But let's zoom in even closer, and we can see that these vertices are almost like hooks that anchor the polygon onto the point. Put simply, we can think of a vertex as the connection between a corner of a polygon, the flat surface area, and the point, or the anchor where it's attached to. Each vertex, or the polygon's vertices, we can think of as those hooks that connect the primitive to the point. If we look here at this example of a single polygon, a single square with 4 points, we can see the distinction between these all. The 4 points, the 1 polygon, and the 4 vertices that hook the polygon onto the points. But if we increased the grid's resolution to a 2x2 grid with 9 points and 4 polygons, we'd see something interesting. In this case, if we think back to the same hooks idea, we can see what happens. To make it easier to see, I've shrunk the purple polygons here just for this diagram. So we can now see that the polygons each have their own unique 4 vertices. But across the different polygons, these vertices might hook to the same point. From this diagram here, we can see that a point can be shared between polygons, but each vertex is unique to the polygon. We can think of the hook as belonging to the polygon itself and not the anchor or the point it's attaching to. So for each gray polygon pictured here, for every point the polygon it's connected to, it has a separate vertex forming that connection. Once we start using Houdini in practice, this gives us another level of the mesh where we can store and access data. So if we remember our color example from the previous lessons, we could store the color attribute values on the points, the individual vertex, or the polygons themselves. As we start to use Houdini, we'll see how these vertices work more in depth. So, to recap, we've now expanded our parts of a mesh, and we can now see that the points are the locations in 3D space, the edges are the connections between points, the polygons are the flat surface areas between the edges, and the vertices are the connections from a polygon corner to a point.